The ratchet was still in his hand when the front door opened. Robert didn't look up right away. He was down on one knee on the warm brick of Anna's driveway, tool bag splayed open beside him, working a stubborn handrem back onto the wheel of her old manual wheelchair. The same chair he'd been keeping alive with spare parts and patience for the better part of 8 months. Anna sat in it above him, one thin hand resting proud on his broad shoulder, and she was already talking to whoever had stepped out onto the porch. He wouldn't take a dime, Anna was saying, warm and pleased, the way a woman sounds when she's showing off something she's been saving. 8 months now, won't let me pay him a cent. I keep telling you, sweetheart, they don't make many like this one. Robert glanced up to nod politely at the daughter he'd heard about 100 times and never met, and the ratchet went still in his hand. Because the woman frozen in the doorway, sharp white blouse, tailored black trousers, a leather bag sliding unnoticed off her shoulder, one hand flying up to cover her mouth, was not a stranger. He knew that face. He'd seen it that very morning, projected on the wall of a plant floor briefing, above the words "effective immediately" and "full operational audit." He'd stood in the back of that room in his work boots at the end of a 12-hour overnight shift and watched the new CEO's photograph while a nervous supervisor explained that every shift, every log, every technician was about to be examined down to the bolt. Serah Sterling, the most feared executive in the entire company, the woman auditing his livelihood. Anna's daughter. You, Sarah's voice cracked across the pavement, barely more than a breath. Her eyes moved from his tired face to the tools, to the wheel, to her mother's proud hand on his shoulder, and something in her carefully arranged world visibly came loose. You fixed my mom's wheelchair? For a long second, nobody moved. Robert became suddenly, painfully aware of the grease on his hands and the exhaustion under his eyes, and the enormous distance between a night shift mechanic on his knees and the woman who signed off on whether he kept his job. He got to his feet slowly, wiping his palms on his cargo pants, searching for something to say, and finding nothing. And Anna, sharp-eyed, delighted Anna, who had missed nothing in 80 years, and certainly wasn't going to start now, looked between the two of them, at her overnight shift handyman, and her billion-dollar daughter, both struck completely speechless on her driveway, and simply smiled. "Well," she said, patting Robert's arm, "I did keep telling you both. Fate's a stubborn thing." She tilted her head up at her daughter. "Serah, honey, this is Robert. Robert, my Serah. I believe you two may have already met somewhere important this morning." Neither of them could answer her. What none of them knew yet, not Robert, not Serah, not even sharp old Anna, was that the audit shaking the plant that week wasn't really an audit at all. It was cover. A corrupt regional manager named Bradford Hayes had been quietly bleeding the company for years, and he needed a fall guy before the numbers caught up with him. Someone reliable, someone invisible, someone with no powerful friends. He'd already chosen the night shift technician with the spotless record and the daughter to feed. He had no idea that the same distrustful, meticulous mechanic he'd picked to frame had a habit of drawing the machine's true failure schematics out by hand, on paper, because he never trusted a system he couldn't hold, and that those rolled-up drawings were, at that very moment, tucked safely out of sight inside the hollow steel frame of the wheelchair Robert was kneeling beside. And he had no idea that the humble man he'd chosen to destroy had spent 8 quiet months earning the loyalty of the one woman on Earth, with the power to burn his whole scheme to the ground. 8 months earlier, none of them had met at all. It started, like most true things do, with something small and broken by the side of a road. If a mechanic on his knees and a CEO in a doorway just made your heart stop the way it stopped theirs, then you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a second of what happens. And before you scroll on, do me one kindness. Tell me down in the comments what corner of the world you're watching from tonight. Drop it below. I read every last one, and there's nothing I love more than sending back a big warm hello and watching just how far this little driveway story can travel. It began like most true things do, with something small and broken by the side of a road. 8 months before the driveway, before the audit, before a CEO stood frozen with her hand over her mouth, Robert was driving home from a double shift when he saw an old woman stranded on a cracked stretch of sidewalk in the gray morning light. Her manual wheelchair had slewed sideways. One wheel canted at a wrong, useless angle, and she was gripping the armrests with a kind of stubborn dignity, refusing to call for help she clearly felt she shouldn't need. Robert pulled over before he'd decided to. He knelt on the concrete in his work clothes, tired to the bone, and looked at the wheel the way he looked at everything that was broken, like it was simply asking a question he already knew the answer to. "Sheared bearing," he said. "She's not going anywhere on this." But I've got a toolkit at home 10 minutes from here. If you can sit tight, I can have you rolling by breakfast." The old woman studied him with sharp, appraising eyes, the eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people fast and getting it right. "And what do I owe you for that?" she asked, testing. "Nothing," Robert said, already standing. "You just owe me the pleasure of not leaving you out here." That was Anna. He came back with his heavy bag, replaced the bearing on the sidewalk while she directed him with opinions she had not been asked for, and that was supposed to be the end of it. It wasn't. A few weeks later, he swung by to check the bearing had seated right, and she had coffee waiting like she'd known he'd come. He greased the axles. He adjusted the sticking footrests. He noticed a dead bulb in her hallway and changed it before she asked. And he tightened a kitchen cabinet that had been dropping its door on her wrist for a year. What started as one repair became a rhythm. Every few weeks, then every week, Robert on his knees somewhere in Anna's house with a tool in his hand and Anna in her chair nearby, talking. And Anna talked mostly about her daughter. "Brilliant," Anna would say, watching him work. "Works harder than any 10 men. Runs something enormous downtown. I can never keep the titles straight." A sly pause. "Single, you know. Married to that job. Somebody ought to fix that too." She'd look at him sideways. "You'd like her, Robert. She needs a good man who isn't scared of her." Robert always laughed it off, easy and low, the way you laugh off a kindness you can't accept. "Miss Anna," he'd say, "I work nights. I've got a 6-year-old, and I fall asleep standing up. Your daughter runs a company. Those are 2 different planets. But I'll fix your footrest again if it comes loose." And Anna would let it go, for the moment, hiding a small private smile, the smile of a woman playing a long game she fully intended to win. He never once thought to ask the daughter's name. Why would he? She lived on the other planet, until she stepped out onto the porch, in a crisp white blouse and tailored trousers, and the 2 planets slammed into each other on the brick driveway. For a long moment after Anna's introduction, neither Robert nor Serah managed a single word. Robert stood wiping grease from his hands onto his cargo pants, hyper-aware of every ordinary thing about himself. Serah stared at him like the ground had shifted under her expensive shoes. He recovered first, because he'd had more practice being uncomfortable. "Miss Sterling," he said carefully, "I want to be clear. I had no idea. 8 months. I never once knew whose mother she was. This isn't me trying to get close to anything. I just met a stranded lady with a broken wheel and I couldn't leave her there." He shook his head. "If it's a problem, I'll stop coming. But somebody's got to keep that bearing greased, and she won't call the medical supply company. She says they talk to her like she's a child." Serah didn't answer that. She was looking at the wheelchair, really looking at it, at the fresh handrim, the clean axles, the small, careful repairs layered over months. The evidence of a man who had shown up for her mother again and again, while she herself had been buried under quarterly targets, and hadn't managed a proper visit in weeks. Her throat worked. When she finally spoke, her clinical executive voice had gone unexpectedly unsteady. "She told me about you," Serah said. "For months. The young man who fixes things. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought she was exaggerating. Lonely. Making a small kindness into a story." She looked at him. "I run 4,000 people, Mr. Vance. Do you know how many of them would kneel on my mother's driveway for free? None. I audit people for a living. I've forgotten what it looks like when someone just gives." Her hand pressed flat to her chest for a second, and then the armor came back up, because she didn't know what to do without it. "Thank you. Thank you." It should have ended there, warm and awkward and complete. It didn't, because down at the plant, a man named Bradford Hayes had already chosen Robert without ever knowing about the driveway. Bradford was the regional manager, a smooth, silver-tongued man with a golf handicap and a spending habit that had, over 3 years, quietly outrun his salary by several $1,000,000. Money he'd siphoned through inflated maintenance contracts and phantom parts orders, all buried in the very logs he oversaw. But the new CEO's audit was closing in, and Bradford knew the numbers wouldn't survive a real look. So he did what cornered men do. He went looking for someone to bleed instead of him. He picked Robert on paper first, the spotless 12-year record, the night shift where no one would vouch for him at review time, the single father who couldn't afford a lawyer or a fight. Then, 3 nights later, Bradford made it real. Assembly Line 4, the plant's most expensive automated line, suffered a catastrophic failure at 3 a.m., a cascade that fused $500,000 of machinery into scrap. And when the forensic logs were pulled, they showed that the overnight maintenance technician assigned to that line had skipped 3 critical lubrication cycles and overridden a safety cutoff. They showed Robert's ID, Robert's timestamps, Robert's signature, all of it fabricated. Bradford had access to the digital maintenance system, and he'd rewritten the history like a man erasing pencil marks. Robert was suspended without pay by morning, walked off the floor in front of his crew, his 12 clean years gone in the space of one meeting. He drove home in the daylight he never saw, sat in his truck outside his own house for a long time, and thought about how he was going to explain to Maria why Daddy was home when he should be sleeping, and how they were going to eat. But Robert had a habit that Bradford, for all his cleverness, could not have known about. Robert did not trust digital systems. He never had. Every machine he serviced, every real failure he diagnosed, he drew out by hand. The true schematic, the actual points of stress and wear, on paper, in pencil. Because a system could be edited by anyone with a password, but a thing you held in your hand was yours. And the night before the failure, servicing line 4, he had drawn the machine's real condition, a documented, pre-existing structural fault in the drive assembly, dated and detailed in his own precise hand. Proof the failure had been building for weeks, long before his shift, exactly where the official logs claimed everything had been fine. He'd rolled those drawings up out of old caution and, because he'd stopped by Anna's on the way home to tighten her footrest, slid the tube of paper into the hollow steel frame of her wheelchair for safekeeping, meaning to file them properly later. He'd forgotten they were even there. Serah had not forgotten a single thing about that driveway. When the framing landed on her desk, when Bradford himself walked into her office grave-faced and recommended they prosecute the negligent technician to protect the company, something in her went cold and still. Because the negligent technician's name was Robert Vance, the man on her mother's driveway, the man who wouldn't take a dime. And Serah Sterling had built an entire career on one skill above all others. She could tell when the numbers were lying to her. She went to see her mother. And her mother, sharp as ever, listened to the whole ugly story and then said, "That boy drew you a picture, whether he knows it or not. He draws everything. Never trusts a computer. Go look inside my chair, Serah. He's been hiding things in that frame for months. Spare bolts, a folded 20 he thinks I don't know about." Anna's eyes glinted. "Check the frame." Serah checked the frame. The rolled schematics slid out into her hands. The board tribunal convened 2 days later, and Bradford arrived confident. His falsified forensic logs queued up, ready to deliver the negligent night shift technician to the wolves and walk away clean. He presented his evidence with real polish, the skipped cycles, the overridden cutoff, the signature. He asked the board to authorize termination and a criminal referral. Then Serah stood. She laid Robert's hand-drawn schematics on the table, dated the night before the failure, documenting a structural fault that the official logs swore did not exist. She laid beside them the maintenance system's access records, pulled quietly by her own forensic team, showing that the history implicating Robert had been written and rewritten from a single administrator account in the hours after the collapse. Bradford's account. She walked the board through the phantom parts orders, the inflated contracts, the 3 years of theft the audit had been circling, and how neatly, how conveniently, a spotless night shift father had been chosen to bury it all. "You didn't just try to destroy an innocent man's livelihood," Serah said, and her voice was the quietest thing in the room, which made it the loudest. "You picked him because you thought he had no one, no lawyer, no powerful friends, nobody who'd look twice." She let the silence stretch. "You picked wrong." Bradford Hayes was fired on the spot, escorted out by security as the authorities were called, his career ending in the same room he'd expected to end Robert's. And Robert's name was cleared completely. 12 clean years restored. Back pay ordered. A formal apology entered into a record he'd never asked anyone to keep. Serah could have let it end there. An HR matter closed. A wrong made right through proper channels. Instead, a week later, she drove herself out to Robert's modest house on the working side of town, alone, without an appointment, with a heavy flat case resting on the passenger seat. She'd bought him a professional mechanic's tool set, the good kind. The kind a man who worked with his hands would recognize on sight as something chosen with care and not just money. He came to the door wary, still braced for the world to take another swing. But she just held out the case and said, "You kept your own records because you didn't trust the system to protect you. And you were right, it didn't. I did, but only because you gave me the tools to." A small, dry, un-CEO-like smile. So, tools for tools. It seemed fair. He didn't know what to do with a gift, this man who only ever gave them. So he did the one thing he did know how to do. He offered her a seat and a cup of coffee, and Serah, who had a driver and a schedule and 4,000 people waiting on her decisions, sat down on a mechanic's porch in the fading light and stayed far longer than she'd planned. She took off her heels at some point, She laughed at something Maria shouted from inside. And Serah Sterling, who used her title like a shield against the whole world, felt the shield sitting uselessly in her lap and, for once, didn't reach to pick it back up. That single evening became a habit neither of them named out loud. Over the next month, Sarah's weekend visits to her mother began landing, with suspicious precision, exactly on the mornings Robert was off shift. Anna noticed, of course, and said nothing, and beamed into her coffee like a woman watching a plan bloom right on schedule. Robert and Sarah started taking walks, long, unhurried loops around the quiet neighborhood while Anna napped, and the walks were where the armor came all the way off. She told him about the loneliness that came stapled to the corner office, the way people either wanted something from her or were afraid of her, and how she'd forgotten, somewhere in the climb, what it was like to be spoken to as just a person. He told her about Maria's mother, who'd left when the baby was 2 and never looked back, and how he'd decided a long time ago that he'd rather be enough for one little girl than impressive to a whole room of strangers. He told her he worked nights so he could be there in the afternoons for pickup, even exhausted, even falling asleep at the kitchen table. Sarah listened to that and understood she had never in her life met a man whose priorities were arranged so completely around love instead of status, and she felt something in her chest quietly reorganize itself. The person who sealed it, though, was 6 years old. Maria had a school science project due, a working model of the solar system, wildly ambitious for a first grader, and Robert, brilliant with a wrench and helpless with foam balls and glitter, was drowning. Sarah found them one Saturday surrounded by a disaster of cardboard and craft paint, and she simply sat down on the floor in her weekend clothes and got to work. She was precise and patient and endlessly encouraging. She showed Maria how to space the planets to actual scale, how to wire a little bulb so the sun would light up, and she never once made the child feel rushed or small. Maria, who was normally shy with new grown-ups, decided within an hour that Sarah was hers. Robert stood in the kitchen doorway watching the CEO who audited 4,000 people lie on his living room floor helping his daughter glue rings onto Saturn, tongue between her teeth in concentration, and he felt the last professional wall inside him quietly fall over. She wasn't his boss on that floor. She wasn't the most feared executive in the company. She was a woman his daughter was already reaching for, and he was in serious, undeniable trouble. Sarah felt it too, and she was braver than he was about it. A few days later, she invited him out. Not to anything glittering, not to the world of galas and valets, but to a small, unpretentious diner 2 towns over, where nobody knew either of their names and the coffee came in thick white mugs. Away from the plant, away from the porch, away from every role they usually wore, they sat across a scarred formica table and finally, carefully, said the true things out loud. She told him she thought about him constantly, in meetings, at midnight, that he'd walked into her clinical ordered life and made a beautiful mess of it. He told her he'd stopped being able to imagine a week without her in it, and that it scared him more than being walked off the plant floor had. They confessed it all under the buzzing diner light, and by the time the check came they were, without either of them announcing it, together. For a few weeks it was the happiest Robert had been in years. Then the rumors reached the office. Someone had seen them at the diner. Someone always sees. It moved through the plant and up into the towers the way those things move. The CEO and a night shift mechanic, the audit that had cleared him, wink wink, wasn't that convenient. The whispers were cruel and small, and they got into Robert's head, because his head had a well-worn track for exactly this kind of doubt. He heard, secondhand, an executive joke that Serah Sterling had found herself a project. He lay awake doing the old math, her world of boardrooms and shareholders and people who'd never respect a man with grease under his nails, and him, dragging her reputation down every time they were seen together. So he did the thing that frightened men who love deeply sometimes do. He tried to end it, to protect her from himself. He told Sarah, stiff and miserable on Anna's porch, that this had been a mistake, that she had a company to run and a name to protect, and couldn't be seen with someone like him, that it was better to stop now before it cost her something real. He said it looking at the floorboards because he couldn't say it to her face. He told himself he was being noble, he was being scared. Miss Sarah was too stunned to fight him in the moment, but Anna was not. Anna cornered her daughter that same evening, eyes flashing, and did not spare her. "You're going to let that good man talk himself out of the best thing that ever happened to either of you? Because some cowards in suits made a joke?" She wrapped the arm of the wheelchair Robert had kept running for 8 months. "I have watched that boy give and never once take. He has spent his whole life being told he belongs in the background. And now the one time something wonderful comes for him, he's trying to hand it back before it can leave him first. That's not nobility, Sarah. That's fear wearing a nice coat. Are you going to let fear win, or are you my daughter?" Serah drove to Robert's house that night. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stood on his front step in the porch light and, when he opened the door, braced for goodbye. She said everything she should have said the first time. I don't measure a man by his bank account or his title. I spend all day around men with enormous ones, and most of them aren't worth the chair they sit in. Her voice shook and she let it. You want to know what I measure? I measure a man by whether he'd kneel on a stranger's driveway for 8 months and never take a dime. By whether my mother trusts him. By whether a 6-year-old reaches for his hand without being told to. You've got all of it, Robert. Every single thing I've spent my whole life too busy to find. And you're standing here trying to give it back because you're scared. And I am not going to let you. She took a breath. Stop running. Let me in. I'm not a project, and you're not beneath me. And I am done pretending either of those things is true. Choose this. Choose me. Please. Robert looked at the woman standing on his step, with her armor gone and her heart out in the open, and every wall he'd spent a lifetime building simply had nowhere left to stand. He reached out and took her hand. The same rough, capable hand that had greased axles and drawn schematics and held his daughters through 100 school gates. And he pulled her inside, out of the cold, into the small, warm house that had just become big enough for one more. 1 year later, on a bright Saturday morning, a community mobility workshop opened its doors on the working side of town. A free repair space where anyone whose wheelchair or walker or mobility scooter had broken down could bring it and have it fixed with dignity and without a bill. It had been Robert's idea and Serah's resources and Anna's relentless insistence, and above the door hung a small hand-painted sign that Maria had helped design. They drove out to the opening together, all 4 of them, in one car. Anna in the back, sharp and satisfied, narrating everyone's business as usual. Maria beside her, 7 now, and fiercely proud, clutching the ribbon they'd cut. And in the front seat, Robert at the wheel and Serah beside him, her hand resting easy in his over the console. No armor between them anymore, no distance, no other planets. Just a night shift mechanic, and the woman who'd stopped counting everything long enough to be counted on. Driving toward a life neither of them had believed they were allowed to want. Together, as the family they had quietly, stubbornly become. And that's the whole story. A broken wheel by the side of a road, a man who wouldn't take a dime, and the sharp old woman who saw the whole ending before anyone else did. If this one warmed you all the way through, do me one small favor and tap that subscribe button, so the next story finds you the moment it's ready. Thank you.